Many people see you as a composer of minimal music. Do you agree with this?
I think that the term minimalism was a useful term. It applied to music that was mostly composed in the 1970s and 80s. I was never a minimalist, but some of the elements of minimalism, the pulsation and the repetition, and also the use of tonal harmonies, were something that influenced me. But my music's always been more complex than what's traditionally called minimalism.
Yeah, I see. If people call you neoclassicist, what do you think about that?
I've never been called a neoclassicist. No? I've been called an American. I'm a Democrat. Neoclassicism it's a style of term, and it generally applies to the music that Stravinsky wrote in the 1920s and 30s, and some other composers like Hindemith. But I don't think it applies to my music at all.
But is there some relationship between your pieces and the specific classical work, like a Beethoven symphony?
I've listened to classical music since I was a very little boy, and I grew up playing it. My first instrument was the clarinet. I began conducting when I was very little. I used to conduct the record player, the stereo system. Mm-hmm. And then when I was a teenager, I became serious as a composer. I listened to a lot of jazz, and then later on I listened to rock, which had a great influence on me. But I've always loved classical music, and that's the way I express myself. So there's a lot of great classical music. There's Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Stravinsky, Wagner, all those composers. So you take them all in, and then when you compose, part of your language is formed by what you listen to.
So there's not one specific composer you have a special relationship with?
No. Not one.
Does your composition start off with a certain musical idea when you start writing?
I never know how a piece starts. Starting a piece can be the most difficult of all the parts of composing, because you don't entirely know what you have. I like to think of a composition almost as from a biological point of view, that each piece has its own DNA, and the composer has to find out and know what the DNA is, and then the piece starts to grow almost like a cell.
And do you always use these cells or these ideas, and what do you do with leftovers?
Sometimes it's a harmony that generates an idea. Usually for me it's a combination of harmony and a rhythm, a rhythmic unit. The most famous one, of course, is Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, because you have this very famous rhythm, and you have the pitches, ba, 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 and you also have the harmony. So very often it's that which begins the piece, but it isn't always that way. Sometimes it's more a general idea, an atmosphere. For example, the last movement of City Noir, my image in my mind was the view of a city at night, looking at it from a distance and seeing all the buildings way off in the dark and the lights glowing and the activity. So that was a visual image to generate the idea. But some other piece, it may be an entirely different idea that suggests it.
But it's mostly not a melody you start off with.
Melodies are very important. There are composers who write good music without melodies. I think for me it's important to be able to write melodies, but it's very difficult to write a melody today and make it new. It's very hard to do that, because as soon as you start writing melodies, it frequently makes the music sound old-fashioned. So I have different ways of trying to invent melodies. Sometimes I do it like a jazz player. I do the harmony first, and then I invent the melody as part of the harmony.
Yeah. Okay. In what environment do you get the best inspiration?
I work very regularly. I think most composers are very regular people. They have the same schedule. It's a lot of work to write a piece, particularly to write an orchestra piece. And you know, I have some friends who are architects, and I tell them, well, you have a very easy job because you do the design, but then you hire all these people to come and do the building. But a composer has to do everything. A composer has to think the piece, but also write it and know all the instruments. You have to be able to know exactly what the bass clarinet does and what the lowest note on the viola, and it takes an enormous amount of knowledge, and it takes an enormous amount of time. So I tend to work as if I were going to a factory or something like that.
Yeah. Have your ideas about composing always been the same, or have you changed your vision about it?
I change all the time. I think creative artists have to change. If they don't, then they begin to repeat themselves, and their work becomes tired and lacks originality.
Yeah. Is the first rehearsal of a new work always a bit of a surprise, or is it exactly the music you hear in your head?
Oh, the first rehearsal is always really very, very difficult. And sometimes it can be a horrific experience. I would say for me, by now, most of what I hear is what I expected. But the things that I don't like usually have to do with balance. Some things are much too loud. That's usually what the problem is. Things are too loud. And it's very hard to know. I mean, you can write pianissimo, or you can write fortissimo, or mezzo forte, but still, you get 100 musicians on the stage, and when they're reading a piece and they don't know it, they play loud all the time. So it's very difficult to get the right balance. And of course, if you don't get the right balance, you don't get the piece you want.
Yeah. When are you satisfied with the work? I am satisfied.
I'm never satisfied with the work. I mean, sometimes I'm happy. Usually with me, because I'm a conductor, I keep conducting my pieces. You know, I have pieces that I wrote 30 years ago, which I still conduct, like Shaker Loops. So that's good, because as I continue to do them, I change my feeling about them, and sometimes I change the tempo a little bit, but it keeps me in a good relationship with my pieces because I'm constantly interacting.